You can't be trusted anymore. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen? The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, its deep bronze voice echoing through the silent house in Greensboro, North Carolina. Evelyn Grace Whitaker, 73 years old, stood at the kitchen window watching the golden September light filter through the oak trees in the backyard. Her weathered hands, marked with age spots and the memory of countless prayers, gripped the edge of the white porcelain sink. The Sunday roast was already in the oven, filling the house with the rich aroma of rosemary and garlic. Sweet tea sat chilling in the refrigerator, and fresh biscuits cooled on the counter. The same recipe she'd used for 50 years, the one that used to make her late husband Samuel close his eyes in pure contentment. The dining table was set with her good china, the pieces she'd saved from her old house when she sold everything to move in with her daughter's family 5 years ago. Evelyn smoothed her navy blue dress, the one with tiny white flowers that Lauren used to say made her look put together. She'd ironed it that morning while whispering her daily prayers, asking the Lord to bless this Sunday dinner, to soften hearts, to bring peace to her family. The small silver cross at her throat caught the kitchen light, a wedding gift from Samuel that she'd worn every day for 48 years. In her pocket, her fingers found the worn edges of a small prayer card, one she'd kept close since moving into this house. "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you," it read. 1 Peter, chapter 5, verse 7. She'd memorized it during those first difficult months, when she realized that her daughter's invitation to come live with us wasn't the blessing she'd thought it would be. The sound of car doors slamming in the driveway made her heart quicken with that familiar mixture of hope and dread. Lauren's voice carried through the evening air, sharp and impatient as she corrected 10-year-old Jacob about something. Travis's deeper voice followed, discussing work calls he needed to return even on Sunday. 12-year-old Madison's feet pounded up the front steps, already absorbed in whatever was happening on her phone screen. Evelyn quickly checked her reflection in the kitchen window's glass. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, her lipstick fresh. She wanted to look like the mother and grandmother they deserved, not the burden she sometimes felt like when she caught the looks they exchanged over her head. The front door opened with its familiar creak. Travis kept saying he'd fix that hinge, but 5 years later, it still protested every entrance and exit. "Mama, we're here," Lauren called, her voice carrying that particular tone of exhaustion that had become her default setting whenever she addressed her mother. There was no warmth in it, no joy at coming home to a house that smelled like Sunday dinner and family love. Evelyn dried her hands on her apron and walked to the living room, where her family was settling in with the weary air of people fulfilling an obligation rather than gathering for fellowship. Lauren looked tired, her brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her scrubs wrinkled from her shift at the medical center. Travis loosened his tie and immediately reached for his phone, his attention already elsewhere. The children collapsed onto the couch without acknowledging their grandmother's presence. "How was church?" Evelyn asked gently, though she already knew they hadn't gone. They'd stopped attending shortly after she moved in, claiming Sunday was their only day to decompress as a family. "We slept in," Lauren replied curtly, not meeting her mother's eyes. "Madison had a sleepover last night, and Jacob had a soccer tournament yesterday. We're tired." Evelyn nodded, swallowing the familiar disappointment. She remembered when Lauren was Madison's age, how they'd sit together in the front pew of Mount Olive Baptist Church, sharing a hymnal and whispering prayers. Those days felt like another lifetime, back when her daughter still believed in the power of Sunday worship and family traditions. "Dinner's ready whenever you are," Evelyn said softly. "I made your favorite roast." "It's not really my favorite anymore, Mama," Lauren sighed. "We've been trying to eat healthier, less red meat." The word stung, but Evelyn forced a smile. She'd been making this same roast for Lauren's birthday every year since she was 5 years old. When had her daughter's preferences changed? When had she stopped noticing what brought her child joy? They gathered around the dining table in a silence broken only by the scraping of forks against plates and Travis's occasional phone notifications. Evelyn watched her family eat the meal she'd spent hours preparing, noting how nobody commented on the food, how Madison kept glancing at her phone despite it being face down beside her plate, how Jacob seemed to be somewhere else entirely. The moment that would change everything came quietly, like most life-altering moments do. Madison's phone buzzed against the table, and without thinking, the 12-year-old reached for it. "Madison, honey," Evelyn said gently, "could you put that away during dinner? It would be nice to talk as a family." The words were barely out of her mouth when Lauren's fork clattered against her plate with a sound like breaking glass. "Can you not go one dinner without criticizing how we raise our kids?" The accusation hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked at her daughter's face, twisted with an anger that seemed far too large for such a small request. "I was just—" Evelyn began, her voice barely a whisper. "Just what? Just judging? Just interfering?" Lauren's voice rose with each word. 5 years of suppressed resentment finally finding its target. "You overstep constantly, Mama. You gossip about our choices to anyone who'll listen. You act like you know better than everyone else about everything." Evelyn felt the room spinning around her. Where was this coming from? When had she gossiped? When had she claimed to know better? "You can't be trusted anymore," Lauren continued, her words landing like hammer blows. "Everything we do, everything we say, becomes some kind of judgment from you. We can't even live in our own house without feeling like we're being graded on our choices." Travis nodded silently, his agreement cutting deeper than any words could have. Jacob stared down at his plate, his young face flushed with embarrassment. Madison still hadn't looked up from her phone. Evelyn gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white against the dark wood. The room felt too small, the air too thin. 5 years of walking on eggshells, of biting her tongue, of trying to make herself smaller and quieter and less bothersome, had led to this moment. "I gave up everything to come here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I left my home, my church, my friends. I thought you needed me." "We never asked for that," Lauren snapped, her voice cold as winter rain. "You invited yourself in, and then acted like a martyr when things weren't exactly how you wanted them. You're not some victim, Mama. You made your choices." The final blow came swift and merciless. "You're a burden." The word hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into every corner of the room, into every memory of shared laughter and whispered bedtime stories and Christmas mornings filled with joy. A burden, not a mother, not a grandmother, not a woman who had sacrificed her own comfort to help raise their children and maintain their home. A burden. Evelyn stood slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. The room swayed, and for a moment she thought she might faint. But her hands found the back of her chair, and she steadied herself with the same quiet strength that had carried her through Samuel's death, through the loneliness of widowhood, through the decision to sell the home where she'd raised her children. "Excuse me," she managed to say, her voice remarkably steady despite the earthquake in her chest. She walked to her room, the small space at the back of the house that they'd converted for her, with its single window facing the neighbor's fence, and its narrow bed that had replaced the king-size mattress she'd shared with Samuel for decades. They called it Nana's Corner, as if she were a piece of furniture to be tucked away when not needed. Evelyn closed the door and sat on the edge of her bed, her hands shaking as she reached for the silver cross at her throat. The metal was warm from her body heat, a small comfort in the vast coldness that had settled in her chest. She wept in silence, her tears falling onto the wedding ring quilt her mother had made 60 years ago. Outside her window, the evening light faded into purple dusk, and somewhere in the house, she could hear the television turning on, normal life resuming as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just been told that her love was a burden, as if 50 years of motherhood had been reduced to nothing more than unwanted interference. Evelyn opened her nightstand drawer and pulled out her worn Bible, its pages soft from decades of reading. She turned to Psalm 27, verse 10. "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." But even as she read the familiar words, a terrible question echoed in the darkness of her heart. Had she failed as a mother? Had her love somehow become poisonous? Was this God's way of showing her that she truly was what Lauren claimed? A burden that nobody wanted to carry? Outside her door, life continued without her, and Evelyn Grace Whitaker sat alone in her corner, holding her Bible and wondering if love could really be wrong when it came from a sincere heart. That night, sleep eluded Evelyn like a bird that refuses to be caught. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while memories flooded her mind like pages from a photo album she couldn't close. She remembered Lauren at 6 years old, burning with fever from pneumonia, how Evelyn had sat beside her bed for 3 days and nights, placing cool cloths on her forehead and whispering prayers until the fever broke. She remembered holding her daughter's hair back during morning sickness with both pregnancies, cooking meals and cleaning house while Lauren recovered from difficult births. When Samuel died 4 years ago, it was Lauren who had called, sobbing into the phone. "Mama, I can't do this without Daddy. I need you here. The kids need their Nana. Please, we have enough room. Come live with us." Evelyn had sold the house where she'd lived for 35 years, the house where Lauren had taken her first steps, where Christmas mornings had been filled with laughter and wrapping paper, where Samuel had proposed on the front porch swing under the magnolia tree. She'd sold it all. The antique dining set her grandmother had left her, the china cabinet filled with wedding gifts, the rocking chair where she'd nursed Lauren and later rocked her grandchildren to sleep. She'd kept only what could fit in one bedroom. And even then, Lauren had complained about the clutter. "Mama, you don't need all this old stuff," Lauren had said, eyeing the cedar chest filled with family quilts and photo albums. "We're trying to keep things minimal here." So Evelyn had packed away most of her life in storage, paying $60 a month from her small Social Security check to keep the remnants of 40 years of marriage in a concrete building on the outskirts of town. She remembered the first Christmas in their house, how she'd offered to cook the traditional feast she'd prepared for decades. "That's too much work for you, Mama," Lauren had said with false concern. "Travis and I ordered everything from the grocery store deli. It'll be easier." Easier for whom? Evelyn had wanted to ask, but she'd bitten her tongue and helped serve store-bought ham and instant mashed potatoes while her heart ached for the kitchen smells of her youth. Cornbread dressing and fresh cranberry sauce and pies cooling on the windowsill. Every night, Evelyn knelt beside her bed and prayed. She prayed for Lauren's stress at work, for Travis's long hours, for Jacob's struggles with reading, for Madison's growing distance from the family. She prayed for patience with her own situation, for wisdom to know when to speak and when to remain silent, for strength to love without being a burden. But sometimes, in the dark hours before dawn, she found herself whispering different prayers. "Lord, did I spoil her too much? Did I fail to teach her kindness? Why does my love feel like such a weight to her?" The truth was, Evelyn had been walking on eggshells for 5 years, trying to make herself invisible while still being helpful. She did their laundry without being asked, folded it, and put it away in drawers that weren't hers. She cooked meals and cleaned up afterward, grateful when anyone mentioned the food and devastated when they ate in silence. She'd learned to ask permission for everything. Could she water the plants on the porch? Could she bake cookies for Jacob's class? Could she take Madison shopping for school clothes? Each request was met with sighs and the weary patience reserved for difficult children. "Mama, we don't need you to do everything for us," Lauren would say. "We're capable adults." But when Evelyn stopped doing the laundry, it piled up until Lauren snapped about not having clean scrubs for work. When she stopped cooking, takeout containers filled the kitchen trash, and Travis complained about the grocery budget. When she stopped cleaning, dust gathered in corners, and Madison asked why Nana had gotten lazy. There was no winning, no path that led to appreciation instead of criticism. The memories that hurt most were the quiet moments of rejection, like when Jacob had come to her room one evening, wanting to hear stories about his grandfather. Evelyn had been in the middle of telling him about Samuel's days as a young carpenter when Lauren appeared in the doorway. "Jacob, don't bother Nana. She needs her rest, and you have homework to finish." The little boy had left immediately, and Evelyn had never been able to finish the story about how his grandfather had built a treehouse with his own hands, how he'd carved Jacob's initials in the trunk, even though Jacob had been just a baby then, or the time Madison had asked about the old photo albums, wanting to see pictures of her mother as a child. Evelyn had pulled out one album, filled with Lauren's school pictures and birthday parties and family vacations to the mountains. "Oh my goodness, Mom looks so different," Madison had laughed, pointing to a picture of Lauren at her age, missing her two front teeth and grinning wildly at the camera. But when Lauren saw them looking at the photos, her expression had darkened. "Madison, put those away. Those pictures are ancient history." "But I want to see," Madison had started. "I said put them away. Nana, can you please keep your things in your room? The kids don't need to be going through old photos all the time." Evelyn had quietly closed the album and returned it to her dresser drawer, where it had remained ever since. That night, she'd cried into her pillow for the stories that would never be told, the family history that was being buried because it reminded Lauren of a past she seemed eager to forget. The financial burden weighed heavily on Evelyn's mind as she lay awake that Sunday night. She paid Lauren $300 a month for room and board, money that came from her modest Social Security and the small pension from Samuel's 30 years at the lumber mill. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She also bought her own groceries, paid for her own medications, and contributed to household expenses without being asked. When the water heater broke last winter, she'd offered the $800 to help replace it. When Madison needed a new laptop for school, Evelyn had quietly handed over $500. When Jacob wanted to join the traveling soccer team, she'd covered the registration fees and tournament expenses. She'd never asked for any of it back, never mentioned these contributions when Lauren complained about money being tight. She'd simply given because that's what mothers do. They give until there's nothing left to give, and then they find a way to give more. But Lauren had memory lapses when it came to her mother's generosity. "We never asked you to pay for anything," she'd say when Evelyn gently mentioned her financial contributions. "That was your choice. Your choice." As if love was a choice that could be turned on and off like a faucet. As if a mother's desire to help her struggling children was some kind of character flaw instead of natural instinct. Evelyn thought about the will she'd updated when she moved in with them, how she'd named Lauren as executor and primary beneficiary of everything she owned. It wasn't much. Some savings, a small life insurance policy, the burial plot next to Samuel at Oak Hill Cemetery. But it represented everything she had to leave behind, her final gift to the daughter who increasingly saw her as nothing but a burden. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd given up her independence, her home, her community, and her dignity to help raise her grandchildren and support her daughter's family. And in return, she'd been told she was a burden who couldn't be trusted. As the grandfather clock chimed midnight, Evelyn whispered into the darkness, "Lord, I don't understand your plan anymore. I tried to love them the way you love us, unconditionally, sacrificially, but maybe I loved them wrong. Maybe I gave too much and asked for too little in return." She thought about Samuel, how he would have handled this situation. He'd been a man of few words, but infinite wisdom, the kind of husband who knew when to speak and when to simply hold her while she cried. He would have said, "Evie, love isn't wrong just because it's not received well. Sometimes the problem isn't with the giver, it's with the receiver." But Samuel was gone, and Evelyn was alone in a house where her love had become an inconvenience, where her presence was tolerated rather than celebrated, where 50 years of motherhood had been reduced to a single devastating word: burden. Outside her window, the night stretched endlessly toward dawn, and Evelyn Grace Whitaker prayed for strength to face another day in a family that no longer seemed to have room for her heart. The worst part wasn't the criticism or the lack of appreciation. The worst part was the growing certainty that perhaps they were right. Perhaps she had become exactly what they said, a burden that nobody wanted to carry, a mother whose love had curdled into something toxic and unwelcome. And if that was true, what was she supposed to do with all this love that had nowhere to go? The weeks following that devastating Sunday dinner passed like a slow-motion nightmare. Evelyn moved through the house like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, asking permission for things she'd never had to ask permission for before. The accusation that she couldn't be trusted echoed in every interaction, making her second-guess every word before it left her mouth. Her 74th birthday came and went without acknowledgement. She woke that Tuesday morning hoping, just hoping, that someone might remember. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the sunrise paint the backyard in shades of gold and amber. Samuel used to surprise her with breakfast in bed on her birthday, usually burnt toast and overly strong coffee that she'd declared perfect every single year. The family rushed through their morning routine around her as if she weren't there. Lauren grabbed a protein bar and her travel mug. Travis checked emails on his phone while eating cereal straight from the box. Madison complained about a test she hadn't studied for. Jacob couldn't find his soccer cleats. Not one of them paused to wish her happy birthday. That evening, Evelyn called her old neighbor from Maple Street, Betty Jean, hoping for a familiar voice that might remember what day it was. "Happy birthday, honey?" Betty Jean's warm voice crackled through the phone. "How are you celebrating? Did Lauren plan something special?" Evelyn forced brightness into her voice. "Oh, you know how it is. Quiet celebration. Family dinner." The lie tasted bitter in her mouth. "Well, you deserve to be spoiled. 74 years of grace and giving. I bet those grandkids are lucky to have you right there with them every day." If only she knew, Evelyn thought. But she couldn't bring herself to burden Betty Jean with the truth. "Yes," she whispered, "very lucky." After hanging up, Evelyn sat in her room and opened the card she'd bought for herself, a simple one with flowers on the front. Inside, she wrote, "Happy birthday, Evelyn. You are loved by God, even when it doesn't feel like it. Love yourself." She tucked the card into her Bible and cried silently into her pillow. 3 days later, the stomach flu hit her hard. She woke up feeling nauseated and weak, barely able to keep water down. By afternoon, she was burning with fever, her head pounding and her body aching in ways that reminded her she was no longer young. She managed to text Lauren, "Not feeling well. Might be the flu." The response came 2 hours later. "Sorry to hear. There's soup in the pantry. Try to stay hydrated." No offer to take her temperature. No suggestion of seeing a doctor. No checking on her throughout the day. For 3 days, Evelyn lay in her small room, too weak to cook, surviving on crackers and lukewarm water from the bathroom tap. She could hear the family's life continuing around her. Homework discussions, meal preparations, arguments about chores. But none of it included checking on the sick grandmother down the hall. On Sunday morning, she forced herself to get dressed for church, something she'd finally been allowed to do after months of gentle requests. Mount Olive Baptist was her spiritual home, the place where she'd been baptized at 12 and married at 25, where she'd dedicated Lauren as a baby and said goodbye to Samuel 4 years ago. She arrived early, as was her habit, and sat in the third pew from the front, the same spot she'd occupied for 50 years. Around her, familiar faces smiled and nodded, but the conversations felt distant, polite rather than warm. "How are you doing, Evelyn?" asked Mrs. Patterson, the organist's wife. "Oh, fine, fine," Evelyn replied automatically. "Staying busy with the grandchildren. That's wonderful. It must be such a blessing to be so involved in their lives." A blessing. Evelyn nodded and smiled, but inside, her heart ached with the irony. If only Mrs. Patterson knew how involved she really was. Cooking meals that went unappreciated, doing laundry that was expected rather than acknowledged, living in a house where her presence was tolerated rather than celebrated. After service, she overheard 2 women talking near the fellowship hall. "Did you see poor Evelyn?" one whispered. "She looks so thin and tired. I wonder if living with her daughter is working out." "Well," the other replied, lowering her voice, "my sister lives near them, and she says it seems like a difficult situation. The daughter works all the time, the son-in-law is never around, and those children have no respect. Evelyn probably has her hands full." Evelyn quickly turned away, heat burning in her cheeks. Even here, in God's house, she was the subject of pity and speculation. She was the elderly woman whose family life wasn't quite right, whose sacrifices were visible to strangers, but invisible to the people she'd given everything to serve. The breaking point came the following week, when she discovered a conversation she was never meant to hear. She'd been folding laundry in the utility room, a weekly task she'd taken on without being asked, when Travis's voice carried through the thin wall that separated the laundry room from his home office. He was on a phone call, his voice lower than usual but still audible through the shared wall. I know, he was saying. She drives Lauren crazy, constantly hovering, constantly judging. We can't even discipline our own kids without her giving us looks. Evelyn's hands stilled on the towel she was folding. The thing is, Travis continued, she pays us $300 a month, plus she covers a lot of household expenses, and free babysitting whenever we need it. It's not like we can afford to lose that income right now, especially with Madison starting high school next year. A long pause, then, yeah, I know it sounds harsh, but we're basically running a business here. Room and board for services rendered. As long as she keeps quiet and doesn't interfere too much, it works out financially. Evelyn's knees buckled. She gripped the edge of the washing machine, her vision blurring with tears she couldn't control. She wasn't a beloved mother and grandmother living with family. She was a tenant, a revenue source, a business arrangement that was tolerated as long as the financial benefits outweighed the personal inconvenience. The laundry basket fell from her hands, sending freshly folded clothes tumbling to the floor. The sound must have carried through the wall because Travis's voice stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of his office door closing with a sharp click. Evelyn knelt on the utility room floor, surrounded by scattered towels and bedsheets, and wept with a grief so deep it felt like drowning. Every kindness she'd thought was family love was revealed as economic necessity. Every moment she'd felt grateful for their inclusion was exposed as her own desperate self-deception. She was paying them to tolerate her presence in their lives. That night, she sat on the edge of her bed with her Bible open to Job 19:19. All my intimate friends detest me. Those I love have turned against me. But Job had been restored, she reminded herself. Job had seen God's faithfulness in the end. Where was her restoration? Where was the evidence that God still saw her, still cared about her broken heart? For the first time since Samuel's death, Evelyn allowed herself to whisper the question that had been growing in the darkness of her heart. Lord, am I being tested? Or have you forgotten about me too? The silence that followed felt infinite and cold. The next morning, while Lauren rushed to get the children ready for school, Evelyn stood at the bathroom mirror and stared at her reflection. Her silver hair was neat, her clothes pressed, her posture still straight, despite 74 years of carrying other people's burdens. But her eyes looked hollow, defeated in a way that scared her. When had she become this invisible woman? When had her voice become so small that even she could barely hear it? When had she stopped believing she deserved better than being a paid inconvenience in her own daughter's life? She touched the silver cross at her throat and whispered, Jesus, I know you were despised and rejected too. I know you understand what it feels like when the people you love see you as a burden. Help me find my way back to myself. Help me remember who I am in your eyes, because I'm forgetting in theirs. Outside the bathroom door, she could hear Lauren yelling at Madison about lost homework and Travis complaining about traffic delays. Normal family chaos that didn't include her, problems she wasn't allowed to help solve, daily dramas where her presence was merely tolerated background noise. Evelyn Grace Whitaker looked at herself in the mirror one more time, and for the first time in 5 years, she didn't like what she saw. Not because of her age or her circumstances, but because somewhere along the way, she'd allowed other people's opinions to become her truth. She'd allowed herself to believe she was a burden instead of a blessing. And that, she realized with growing clarity, was going to have to change, even if she didn't yet know how. The confrontation came on a rainy Thursday evening in late October, when the autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter's approach. Evelyn had spent the day wrestling with a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The overheard conversation with Travis had been replaying in her mind for weeks, each repetition adding weight to the growing certainty that something fundamental had to change. She'd been cleaning out her dresser drawer when her fingers found the manila folder tucked beneath her winter sweaters, the folder containing all her important documents, her will, her insurance papers, the deed to the burial plot beside Samuel, the small savings account that represented 40 years of careful budgeting and the sale of everything she'd owned. All of it designated for Lauren, all of it given in love to a daughter who saw her as nothing more than a financial arrangement. That evening, when the family gathered for dinner around the kitchen table, Evelyn cleared her throat softly. I need to speak with all of you about something important. Lauren looked up from her phone with irritation. Mama, can it wait? I've got to review these patient charts tonight, and Travis has conference calls until 9. No, Evelyn said quietly, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. It can't wait. Something in her tone must have registered, because Travis put down his fork and Madison actually looked up from her ever-present phone screen. Jacob continued eating, but his eyes darted nervously between the adults. I've been thinking about our living arrangement, Evelyn began, her hands folded carefully in her lap to hide their trembling. And I've realized that this situation isn't working for any of us. Lauren's expression immediately shifted to defensive. What do you mean? What situation? I mean the fact that I'm paying you to tolerate my presence in your home, Evelyn said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I overheard your conversation with Travis last week about how I'm basically a business arrangement. Room and board for services rendered, I believe, were your words. Travis had the grace to look embarrassed, but Lauren's face flushed with anger rather than shame. You were eavesdropping on a private conversation? I was folding your laundry in the utility room, Evelyn replied. Your private conversation happened to be loud enough to hear through the wall. That conversation was taken out of context, Lauren stammered. Travis was just, you were discussing how my presence drives you crazy, but the money I contribute makes it worth tolerating, Evelyn interrupted, feeling strength flow through her that she hadn't experienced in years. You were talking about me like I'm a difficult tenant rather than your mother. The silence that followed was deafening. Madison looked genuinely shocked, her young face reflecting confusion about this glimpse into adult realities she'd never considered. Jacob had stopped eating entirely, his eyes wide with the fear that children feel when the adult world starts cracking around them. That's not fair, Lauren finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. We never asked you to come here. We never asked you to give up your house. You made that decision on your own. You called me when Dad died, Evelyn said, her voice beginning to shake with suppressed emotion. You called me crying, saying you couldn't do it without him, saying the kids needed their Nana, begging me to come live with you. Were those lies? I was grieving, Lauren shot back. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was scared and sad, and I thought having you here would help. But it's been 5 years, Mama. 5 years of walking on eggshells, of feeling judged in my own home, of having every parenting decision questioned. When have I questioned your parenting? Evelyn asked, genuinely bewildered. Every time you ask Madison to put away her phone, every time you try to read Bible stories to Jacob, every time you make those little faces when we order takeout instead of cooking, every time you sigh when we don't go to church. The accusations hit Evelyn like stones thrown with precision. She searched her memory, trying to recall the facial expressions Lauren described. The sighs that had apparently been cataloged as judgments. Had she really been so obvious in her disappointment? Had her efforts to maintain family traditions been received as criticism rather than love? I was trying to help, Evelyn whispered. I was trying to be useful, but we didn't need your kind of help, Lauren said, and the words landed like physical blows. We needed you to trust us to be the parents. We needed you to let us live our lives without constant commentary from someone who raised children 50 years ago. Travis finally spoke up, his voice careful and measured. Evelyn, we appreciate everything you've done. We really do. But Lauren's right. Sometimes it feels like you're trying to live through us instead of living your own life. Like you gave up your independence and now expect us to make up for what you lost. The observation cut deep because it contained a grain of truth that Evelyn had been avoiding. Had she been trying to recreate her younger years through her grandchildren? Had her loneliness after Samuel's death made her cling too tightly to a family that needed space to grow? So what are you saying? Evelyn asked, though part of her already knew the answer. We're saying maybe it's time for you to think about other living arrangements, Lauren said, her voice growing firmer with each word. There are nice senior communities in town, places where you could make friends your own age, where you could have activities and independence. Senior communities. The euphemism for warehouses where families stored elderly relatives they no longer wanted to deal with. Evelyn had visited enough of them after Samuel's death to know what Lauren was really suggesting, exile disguised as independence. You want me to leave, Evelyn said, the statement hanging in the air like smoke from a burned bridge. "We want you to be happy," Travis said, but his relief was visible. "And we want our family to have space to be ourselves without feeling like we're being constantly evaluated." Madison suddenly burst into tears, her 12-year-old heart finally processing what was happening. "You're making Nana leave? Where will she go?" "Honey, it's not making her leave," Lauren said quickly, reaching for her daughter's hand. "It's helping her find a place where she'll be happier, where she can have her own space and her own friends." "But I like having Nana here," Jacob said quietly, speaking for the first time since the conversation began. "She makes good cookies, and she helps me with math." The children's protests seemed to strengthen Lauren's resolve rather than weaken it. "Kids, this is an adult decision. You'll still see Nana all the time. She'll just live somewhere else." Evelyn looked around the table at these 4 people she'd loved with everything in her heart, and for the first time in 5 years, she saw them clearly. Lauren, exhausted and defensive, genuinely believing that her mother's presence was toxic to her family's happiness. Travis, uncomfortable but supportive of his wife's decision. Madison, confused and hurt by adult complexities she couldn't understand. Jacob, the only one who seemed genuinely sad about losing his grandmother's daily presence. "You know what?" Evelyn said, standing slowly from her chair. "You're right." The words surprised everyone, including herself. "I am right?" Lauren asked, suspicion replacing defensiveness. "You're right that this arrangement isn't working," Evelyn continued, feeling clarity wash over her like cool water. "You're right that I need to think about other living arrangements, but not for the reasons you think." She looked directly at Lauren, then at Travis. "I need to leave because I've forgotten who I am in this house. I've spent 5 years trying to make myself small enough to fit into your lives, and in doing so, I've lost myself completely." "Mama," Lauren began, but Evelyn held up her hand. "Let me finish. I came here thinking I was helping family. I thought I was providing love and support during difficult times, but I realize now that I was also running away from grief, from loneliness, from the hard work of building a new life after your father died." She paused, feeling words form that she'd never spoken aloud before. "And maybe, just maybe, I was expecting you to fill a hole in my heart that only God should fill. Maybe I was asking you to be something you were never meant to be." The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows and Madison's soft sniffling. "But here's what I need you to understand," Evelyn continued, her voice growing stronger. "A mother's love is never a burden, even when it's inconvenient. The fact that you see my care as criticism says more about your own insecurities than it does about my intentions." Lauren's face flushed red. "You can't turn this around on me. You can't make yourself the victim here." "I'm not trying to be a victim," Evelyn replied calmly. "I'm trying to be honest. About my mistakes and about yours. About the ways we've both failed each other over these past 5 years." She looked at her grandchildren, their young faces reflecting confusion and sadness that broke her heart. Would Jesus forgive this too? She wondered silently. Should I forgive again and again, even when it means losing myself in the process? "I'll start looking for a place tomorrow," Evelyn announced, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. "But I want you to understand something. I'm not leaving because you're right about me being a burden. I'm leaving because I deserve better than being tolerated for financial convenience." The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to deny the truth of what Travis had said on that phone call. "And I'm leaving because these children deserve a grandmother who knows her own worth, not one who begs for scraps of affection from people who should love her unconditionally." As Evelyn walked to her room that night, she could hear heated whispers from the kitchen. Lauren and Travis discussing damage control, Madison crying about changes she didn't understand, Jacob asking questions no one seemed able to answer. But for the first time in 5 years, Evelyn felt something she'd almost forgotten: the quiet dignity of a woman who knew exactly who she was and refused to apologize for taking up space in the world, even if that space could no longer be in her daughter's home. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with November frost painting the windows in delicate patterns that reminded Evelyn of the lace curtains her mother used to make. She woke before sunrise, as had become her habit, and knelt beside her narrow bed for morning prayers. But today, instead of her usual supplications for family harmony and patience with difficult circumstances, she found herself praying for something entirely different. "Lord," she whispered into the pre-dawn darkness, "show me who I'm supposed to be when I'm not trying to be what everyone else needs me to be. Help me find my way back to the woman you created, not the woman I've been pretending to be to keep peace." She dressed carefully in her navy blue dress with the small white flowers, the one Lauren used to compliment but now criticized as too formal for every day. Today she chose it deliberately, as armor for the battle she was about to fight for her own soul. The house was still quiet when she slipped into the kitchen and made herself a cup of coffee. She sat at the table where so many silent meals had been endured, where so many careful words had been weighed and measured, and opened her worn Bible to Ephesians 4:32. "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you." Forgiveness, the word that had defined so much of her life, sometimes in beautiful ways and sometimes in ways that had nearly destroyed her spirit. She'd forgiven Samuel's occasional thoughtlessness, her parents' emotional distance, her sister's selfishness, and most recently, 5 years of subtle cruelty from the daughter she'd raised with unconditional love. But what if forgiveness didn't mean accepting endless mistreatment? What if true forgiveness actually required her to stop enabling bad behavior by refusing to be its victim? The revelation hit her like morning sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She could forgive Lauren without allowing Lauren to continue hurting her. She could love her family without sacrificing her own dignity on the altar of their convenience. At 8 o'clock that morning, while Lauren was still getting ready for work and Travis was already gone, Evelyn made the first phone call that would change everything. "Greenwood Senior Living Community," a cheerful voice answered. "This is Sarah. How may I help you?" "I'd like to schedule a tour," Evelyn said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I'm considering a move, and I'd like to see what options might be available." "Of course. Are you looking for independent living, assisted living, or just gathering information for the future?" "Independent living," Evelyn replied firmly. "I'm 74 and in good health. I just need a place where I can live with dignity." The words felt strange in her mouth. Dignity. When had she started thinking of dignity as something she needed to ask for, rather than something she inherently possessed? Sarah scheduled her for a tour that afternoon, and Evelyn hung up the phone feeling both terrified and exhilarated. For 5 years, she'd been living according to other people's schedules, other people's needs, other people's definitions of what her life should look like. Today, she was choosing for herself. After Lauren left for work with barely a goodbye, Evelyn called her old friend Ruth Ann Caldwell, the one person who'd known her before she became a grandmother, before she became a widow, before she became a burden. "Ruth Ann, it's Evelyn Whitaker." "Evelyn! Lord have mercy, it's been too long. How are you, honey? How's life with Lauren and the family?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time in 5 years, Evelyn decided to answer honestly. "It's been difficult, Ruth Ann. More difficult than I ever admitted, even to myself." There was a pause, then Ruth Ann's voice gentler now. "Tell me, honey. Tell me what's really been happening." And so Evelyn did. She told her oldest friend about the overheard conversation, about being called a burden, about feeling invisible in a house where she paid rent to be tolerated. She told her about forgotten birthdays and dismissive comments and the slow erosion of her sense of self-worth. "Oh, Evelyn," Ruth Ann said when the story was finished. "Why didn't you call me sooner? Why didn't you tell me how bad things had gotten?" "Because I was ashamed," Evelyn admitted. "I was ashamed that I'd raised a daughter who could treat me this way. I was ashamed that I'd given up my independence for people who didn't want me. I was ashamed that I'd been so blind to what was really happening." "Listen to me, Evelyn Grace Whitaker," Ruth Ann said, her voice carrying the authority of 50 years of friendship. "You have nothing to be ashamed of. Nothing. You loved with your whole heart, and if other people can't appreciate that, it's their loss, not your failure." Ruth Ann lived about 30 miles away in the small town of Shelby, on a little farm she'd inherited from her late husband. She'd been Evelyn's closest friend since childhood, the kind of friend who remembered who you were before life taught you to be smaller. "Why don't you come stay with me for a while?" Ruth Ann offered. "Just until you figure out what you want to do next. I've got plenty of room, and Lord knows I could use the company. This old house gets lonely with just me and the chickens." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. A place to go that wasn't a senior community or a homeless shelter. A place where someone actually wanted her company rather than merely tolerating her presence. "Are you sure?" Evelyn asked. "I don't want to be a burden." "Stop that right there," Ruth Ann interrupted. "You are not a burden. You are a blessing that some people are too foolish to recognize. And if you use that word about yourself one more time, I'm going to drive over there and wash your mouth out with soap like we're 12 years old again." For the first time in months, Evelyn laughed. Actually laughed, with joy rather than politeness. That afternoon, she toured Greenwood Senior Living, a well-maintained facility with cheerful common areas and small apartments designed for independent seniors. Sarah, the coordinator, was kind and patient, showing Evelyn everything from the dining room to the chapel to the library where residents could pursue hobbies and continuing education. "We have a wonderful community here," Sarah explained as they walked through the garden courtyard. Book clubs, quilting circles, Bible study groups, exercise classes. Many of our residents say they wished they'd moved here sooner because they've found friendships and activities they never had time for when they were managing their own homes. The apartment she was shown was small but bright, with a kitchenette, a living area, and a bedroom with a view of the gardens. It was clean and safe and designed for someone exactly like her, an elderly person whose family had decided she needed managing. "What would you say are the biggest challenges new residents face?" Evelyn asked as they concluded the tour. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Honestly, learning to live for themselves again instead of living for their families. A lot of our residents come here after years of defining themselves through their roles as caregivers, parents, or supporters. It takes time to rediscover who they are as individuals." The observation hit uncomfortably close to home. When had Evelyn last done something purely because she wanted to do it, rather than because someone else needed it done? That evening, she sat in her room and made a list of the practical steps required to reclaim her life. Call the lawyer about updating her will. Research her financial options. Decide what possessions truly mattered to her and what had just been accumulating dust. Most importantly, she needed to have one final conversation with Lauren, not as a supplicant begging for acceptance, but as a woman claiming her right to be treated with basic human decency. She pulled out her phone and composed a text message. "I need to speak with you privately tonight after the children go to bed. It's important." Lauren's response came quickly. "Can it wait? I have patient charts to review." For 5 years, Evelyn would have apologized and waited. "Tonight," she typed back. "No, it can't wait. This conversation is happening tonight, one way or another." The boldness of her own words surprised her, but she didn't delete them. She hit send and felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of chains she hadn't even realized she was wearing. When Lauren knocked on her bedroom door that night, her expression was wary, defensive. "What did you want to talk about?" Evelyn gestured to the chair beside her dresser. "Please sit down. I'd rather stand than stand. But listen." Evelyn took a breath that felt like the first real breath she'd taken in years. "I've found a place to live. I'm moving out next week." Lauren's relief was immediate and visible. "Oh, well, that's probably for the best. Where are you going? One of those senior places?" "I'm going to stay with Ruth Ann Caldwell for a while, and then we'll see." Evelyn kept her voice level and calm. "But before I go, I need to say some things, and I need you to hear them." Lauren crossed her arms but remained silent. "I forgive you," Evelyn said simply. "I forgive you for calling me a burden. I forgive you for treating me like a tenant in your home rather than your mother. I forgive you for making me feel invisible and unwanted and ashamed of loving too much." "Mama, I'm not finished." The authority in Evelyn's voice stopped Lauren's interruption. "I forgive you, but I won't enable you anymore. I won't continue to accept treatment that diminishes my worth as a human being. I won't continue to beg for scraps of affection from people who should love me unconditionally." Tears began flowing down Evelyn's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "I love you, Lauren. I love you enough to stop letting you treat me badly, because that's not love. That's fear. And I'm done being afraid of losing people who've already decided I'm disposable." Lauren stood frozen, her face cycling through emotions: anger, guilt, confusion, and something that might have been recognition. "I've removed your name from my will and my insurance policies," Evelyn continued. "Not out of spite, but because I finally understand that blessing someone who sees your love as a burden isn't actually a blessing at all." "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. I've set up college funds for Jacob and Madison that they can access when they turn 25. But you and Travis will receive nothing from me, because I've realized that giving gifts to people who don't appreciate them isn't generosity. It's enabling." Lauren's face flushed red. "So this is all about money? You're punishing us financially because we hurt your feelings?" "This is about dignity," Evelyn replied calmly. "This is about refusing to pay people to tolerate my existence. This is about finally understanding that love shouldn't cost everything I am." She stood and walked to her closet, pulling out the small suitcase she'd used for church retreats, back when she still had a church community that welcomed her participation. "I'll be gone by Sunday morning," she said. "Ruth Ann is coming to pick me up after breakfast." As Lauren stood in the doorway, apparently struggling to find words, Evelyn felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years: peace. The deep, abiding peace that comes from finally telling the truth and accepting the consequences. "I hope someday you'll understand," Evelyn said softly. "I hope someday you'll realize that a mother's love is never a burden, even when it's inconvenient. And I hope someday you'll forgive yourself for forgetting that." Lauren left without another word, and Evelyn continued packing, each folded item representing another step toward the woman she used to be, the woman she was determined to become again. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November sunshine that makes bare tree branches look like cathedral windows against a brilliant blue sky. Evelyn woke naturally at 5:30, as she had every morning for 74 years. But today felt different. Today felt like the first morning of a life she was choosing, rather than simply enduring. She dressed carefully in her best burgundy dress, the one she'd worn to Samuel's funeral 4 years ago. It seemed appropriate. She was mourning the end of one life while celebrating the beginning of another. She packed her remaining belongings into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box, amazed by how little space was required to hold everything that truly mattered to her. The family Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, the quilt her mother had made for her wedding, the photo albums that Lauren had dismissed as ancient history, the small jewelry box containing her wedding ring, and the few pieces Samuel had given her over the years. Everything else, the clothes she'd bought to fit into their lifestyle, the decorative items she'd accumulated trying to make her corner of their house feel like home, she left behind. Ruth Ann was scheduled to arrive at 9 o'clock, but at 8:15, as Evelyn was making her final cup of coffee in Lauren's kitchen, she heard footsteps on the stairs. The entire family appeared, dressed and unusually quiet, gathering around the breakfast table like defendants waiting for a verdict. "You're really leaving," Madison said, her 12-year-old voice small and confused. "Yes, sweetheart, I am." Evelyn knelt beside her granddaughter's chair, taking the girl's hands in her weathered ones. "But not because I don't love you. I'm leaving because sometimes loving someone means showing them what healthy relationships look like." "But where will you go?" Jacob asked, his 10-year-old logic struggling to understand why grandmothers needed to have somewhere else to live. "I'm going to stay with my friend Ruth Ann for a while," Evelyn explained gently. "She has a farm with chickens and a big garden, and we're going to remember what it feels like to choose joy every day." Travis cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Evelyn, maybe we should talk about this more. Maybe we can work something out." "No." The word came out more firmly than Evelyn had intended, surprising everyone, including herself. "We've talked enough. For 5 years I've been talking and hoping and adjusting and apologizing. Now it's time for action." She stood and faced Lauren, who'd been silent through this exchange, her expression unreadable. "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say, because I may never have the courage to say it again." Lauren's defenses were already rising, her shoulders tensing for another confrontation, but Evelyn's voice remained calm, almost gentle. "I forgive you for calling me a burden, but I won't pretend it didn't happen. I forgive you for treating my love like an inconvenience, but I won't continue to offer it to people who don't want to receive it. I forgive you for making me feel invisible in my own family, but I won't continue to live that way." She paused, gathering strength for the words that needed to be said. Most importantly, I forgive myself for allowing you to treat me that way. I forgive myself for believing that love meant accepting cruelty in silence. I forgive myself for thinking that being a good mother meant disappearing so my daughter could feel more comfortable. Madison began crying softly, the emotions in the room too complex for her young heart to process. Jacob moved closer to his grandmother, his face serious with the weight of adult problems he was witnessing, but couldn't yet understand. "Will we still see you?" he asked quietly. Evelyn's heart broke a little more. "That depends on your parents, sweetheart. I hope so. I pray so. But it will only happen if they decide they want a relationship with me based on respect rather than convenience." Lauren finally spoke, her voice tight with emotion she was clearly struggling to control. "You're making this about respect, but what about your responsibility to this family? What about the fact that we've supported you for 5 years?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, and Evelyn felt the familiar urge to apologize, to minimize her own worth, to accept blame for circumstances beyond her control. But something had changed in her overnight, some fundamental shift that made retreat impossible. "I've paid you $300 a month in rent for 5 years, she said quietly. "That's $18,000. I've contributed to grocery bills, utility payments, household repairs, and the children's expenses. I've provided free childcare, housekeeping, and meal preparation. If you want to talk about financial support, let's be honest about who's been supporting whom." Travis had the grace to look uncomfortable, but Lauren's face flushed with anger. "Money isn't everything, Mama. We gave you a home when you had nowhere else to go. You gave me a room in exchange for services rendered," Evelyn corrected gently. "There's a difference between offering someone a home and running a business arrangement disguised as family love." The front doorbell rang, saving them all from the escalating tension. Through the window, Evelyn could see Ruth Ann's old blue pickup truck in the driveway, and her heart lifted with something that felt remarkably like hope. "That's my ride," she announced, picking up her purse and the small box containing her most treasured possessions. But before she could reach the door, something unexpected happened. Jacob stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her waist in a fierce hug. "I love you, Nana," he whispered into her dress. "I'm sorry they were mean to you." Evelyn knelt and hugged him back, breathing in the scent of his hair and memorizing the feeling of his small arms around her neck. "I love you too, sweet boy. More than you'll ever know. And none of this is your fault, do you understand? Sometimes adults make decisions that hurt, but it's never the children's fault." Madison joined the hug, her tears falling freely now. "I love you too, Nana. I don't want you to go. I love you both so much," Evelyn whispered, holding her grandchildren close and trying to imprint this moment in her memory. "And that love doesn't go away just because I'm living somewhere else. Love doesn't have a distance limit." When she finally stood and faced Lauren and Travis, she saw something in her daughter's eyes that might have been regret. Or perhaps it was just relief disguised as sadness. It was impossible to tell. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Lauren said stiffly. "I have," Evelyn replied. "I'm looking for dignity, and I've found it. I'm looking for peace, and I'm choosing it. I'm looking for a life where love doesn't cost everything I am, and I'm building it." She picked up her suitcases and walked toward the door, each step feeling lighter than the last. Behind her, she could hear Madison crying and Jacob asking questions his parents probably couldn't answer. Ruth Ann was waiting on the front porch, her weathered face creased with concern and compassion. At 72, she still moved with the vitality of someone who'd spent her life working with her hands and finding joy in simple things. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore the kind of comfortable clothes that suggested function over fashion. "You ready for this, honey?" Ruth Ann asked, taking one of the suitcases without being asked. "I've been ready for 5 years," Evelyn replied. "I just didn't know it yet." As they loaded her belongings into the truck, Evelyn turned back to look at the house that had been her home, but never her sanctuary. Lauren stood in the doorway with the children, her expression unreadable. Travis was already heading back inside, apparently considering the drama concluded. But it was Jacob who moved Evelyn to tears. The 10-year-old boy pulled away from his mother and ran down the front steps, calling out as Ruth Ann started the truck engine. "Nana, wait!" Evelyn rolled down the window as he approached, his face flushed with the urgency of whatever he needed to say. "I heard them talking," he said quietly, glancing back at his parents to make sure they couldn't hear. "I heard Dad say mean things about you, but I want you to know, I think you're the best person in our whole family, and when I grow up, I want to be like you." The words hit Evelyn like a blessing from heaven, validation that her love hadn't been wasted, that her example had planted seeds in fertile ground. "You be exactly like yourself, sweet boy," she told him through the window. "But remember what you saw here. Remember that people deserve to be treated with kindness, especially the people who love you most." As Ruth Ann's truck pulled away from the curb, Evelyn watched her old life grow smaller in the side mirror until it disappeared entirely. For the first time in 5 years, she wasn't looking back with regret or forward with anxiety. She was simply present in the moment, surrounded by the peaceful silence of a woman who had finally chosen herself. "How are you feeling?" Ruth Ann asked, as they turned onto the highway that would take them to Shelby. Evelyn considered the question carefully, surprised by the complexity of her emotions. Sad, certainly. Relieved, absolutely. But underneath those surface feelings was something deeper, something that felt like the first green shoots of spring pushing through winter ground. "Free," she said finally. "For the first time in years, I feel free." Ruth Ann reached over and patted her hand. "Freedom's a fine thing, honey. Takes courage to claim it. But once you do, you remember who you were meant to be all along." As the familiar landscapes of Greensboro gave way to rolling farmland and open sky, Evelyn Grace Whitaker closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for the ending she was leaving behind, but for the beginning that stretched ahead like an open road leading to possibilities she was finally brave enough to explore. Ruth Ann's farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel road lined with ancient oak trees, their bare November branches creating a cathedral ceiling against the pale sky. The house itself was a testament to practical beauty: white clapboard siding weathered to a soft gray, a wraparound porch with rocking chairs positioned to catch both morning and evening light, and flower boxes that promised spectacular blooms come spring. "Welcome home, honey," Ruth Ann said as she pulled the truck up to the front porch. Home. The word resonated in Evelyn's chest like a bell being struck for the first time in years. Not a room rented for convenience, not a space tolerated for financial benefit, but an actual home where someone wanted her presence rather than merely enduring it. The interior of the farmhouse wrapped around Evelyn like a warm embrace. Hardwood floors worn smooth by decades of living, quilts draped over furniture that showed the comfortable shabbiness of pieces chosen for comfort rather than impression, and windows that framed views of rolling pastures where a few chickens scratched contentedly in the dirt. "This is your room," Ruth Ann announced, opening the door to a sunny space at the back of the house. "It's got its own bathroom, and the window looks out over the garden. Come spring, you'll wake up to the most beautiful view of daffodils and irises you've ever seen." The room was simple but welcoming. A double bed covered with a hand-stitched quilt, a dresser with a mirror that reflected morning light, and a comfortable reading chair positioned near the window. On the nightstand sat a small vase with fresh greenery from Ruth Ann's garden and a folded note that read, "For new beginnings and second chances." That first night, Evelyn slept deeper than she had in 5 years. No sounds of family arguments filtering through thin walls. No anxiety about whether her presence was welcome. No careful monitoring of her own breathing to avoid disturbing people who saw her as an inconvenience. Just the peaceful silence of a country night, and the knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She woke to the sound of roosters crowing and sunlight streaming through windows that faced east, toward new beginnings. In the kitchen, Ruth Ann was already making coffee, humming an old hymn while she worked. "Sleep well?" Ruth Ann asked, pouring 2 cups of coffee into mismatched mugs that somehow made the gesture feel more welcoming than fine china ever could. "Like a baby," Evelyn replied, and realized she meant it completely. Over breakfast, Ruth Ann outlined their daily routine: morning coffee on the porch, afternoon visits with the chickens, evening reading time by the fireplace. Simple pleasures that reminded Evelyn of a life she'd almost forgotten, back when days were measured by contentment rather than conflict. "There's no schedule you have to follow," Ruth Ann assured her. No expectations except to be yourself and let yourself heal. You've been carrying other people's emotional baggage for too long. Time to set it down and remember who Evelyn Whitaker is when she's not trying to please everybody else. The first week passed in a blur of rediscovery. Evelyn helped with small chores around the farm, feeding chickens, tending to Ruth Ann's indoor herb garden, preparing simple meals that they ate while discussing everything from old memories to current events. But most importantly, she did something she hadn't done in years. She rested. Not the exhausted collapse of someone who'd been running on empty, but the intentional rest of someone who was finally allowing herself to exist without justifying her presence every moment of every day. On her second Sunday at the farm, Ruth Ann invited her to attend the small community church at the end of their road. It's nothing fancy, she warned. About 30 people on a good Sunday, piano music instead of an organ, and sermons that tend toward practical application rather than theological theory. Evelyn hesitated. Her experiences with Lauren's family had made her wary of religious community, afraid that even in God's house she might be judged as inadequate or burdensome. What if they ask too many questions about my situation? She worried. Then you tell them exactly as much or as little as you want to share, Ruth Ann replied firmly. And if anyone makes you feel unwelcome, we'll leave immediately and find a different church. But honey, you need to be around people who understand that faith is supposed to lift you up, not weigh you down. The little white church was exactly as Ruth Ann had described. Simple, welcoming, filled with people who seemed genuinely glad to see both familiar and new faces. Pastor Williams was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and the sort of gentle authority that comes from years of shepherding souls through life's difficulties. When he asked if there were any visitors who'd like to introduce themselves, Evelyn found herself standing before she'd consciously decided to do so. I'm Evelyn Whitaker, she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. I'm staying with Ruth Ann while I figure out what God wants me to do next. The congregation's response was immediate and warm. Smiles, nods, and several amens that made her feel welcomed rather than scrutinized. After the service, people approached not with curiosity about her circumstances, but with simple offers of friendship and community. We have a Wednesday evening Bible study, mentioned Mrs. Harrison, a woman about Evelyn's age with silver hair and laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived. Nothing too formal, just folks gathering to discuss scripture and pray for each other. You'd be welcome to join us anytime. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt the stirring of spiritual hunger that had nothing to do with obligation or family expectations. This was faith as she remembered it from her childhood, a community of believers supporting each other through life's challenges, finding strength in shared prayer and mutual encouragement. I'd like that very much, she replied, and meant every word. The breakthrough came during her third week at the farm, while she was helping Ruth Ann sort through old photographs for a scrapbook project. Among the pictures of family gatherings and farm life, Evelyn found a photograph of herself and Ruth Ann at age 16, standing in front of their high school on graduation day. In the picture, young Evelyn was laughing at something beyond the camera's view, her face radiant with joy and possibility. Her posture was confident, her smile genuine, her entire being radiating the kind of self-assurance that comes from knowing you're exactly who you're supposed to be. Look at her, Evelyn whispered, touching the photograph with trembling fingers. Look how happy she was. Look how alive. Ruth Ann set down her coffee cup and studied her friend's face. She's still in there, you know. That girl who believed in herself, who knew her own worth, who wasn't afraid to take up space in the world. She just got buried under years of trying to be what other people needed, instead of who God created her to be. That night, Evelyn knelt beside her bed and prayed with more honesty than she'd managed in years. Not the careful prayers of someone trying to avoid divine displeasure, but the raw, desperate prayers of someone who'd finally decided to trust God with the complete truth of her heart. Lord, she whispered into the darkness, I've lost myself somewhere along the way. I've been so busy trying to love people who didn't want my love that I forgot how to love myself the way you love me. Help me find my way back to the woman you created me to be. Help me remember that your love doesn't require me to disappear. The answer came not in thunder or lightning, but in the gentle certainty that settled in her chest like morning light after a long night. She was beloved. She was valued. She was worthy of respect and kindness and all the good things she'd spent years giving to others while denying to herself. The next morning, she woke with purpose for the first time in years. She called the lawyer Ruth Ann had recommended and scheduled an appointment to discuss her financial situation and legal options. She contacted her old church in Greensboro and arranged to transfer her membership to the little community church where she'd been so warmly welcomed. Most importantly, she began the process of truly forgiving herself, not just for allowing others to mistreat her, but for believing she deserved such treatment in the first place. "I want to do something I've never done before," she announced to Ruth Ann over breakfast. "What's that, honey?" "I want to take a trip. Somewhere I've always wanted to go but never had the chance. I want to see something beautiful just because I want to see it, not because it serves anyone else's purpose." Ruth Ann's face broke into a delighted grin. "Where do you want to go?" Evelyn had been thinking about this all morning, remembering childhood dreams that had been set aside for more practical concerns. The mountains. The Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. I've seen pictures my whole life, but I've never actually been there. I want to see God's creation in all its glory and remember what it feels like to be amazed by beauty. "Then that's exactly what we're going to do," Ruth Ann declared. "Road trip to Virginia, just two old ladies chasing beauty and freedom. When do we leave?" The spontaneous joy in Ruth Ann's voice reminded Evelyn of something crucial she'd forgotten. Life was meant to be lived, not just endured. Happiness wasn't selfish if it didn't come at someone else's expense. Joy was actually a form of worship, a way of honoring the God who'd created a world full of wonders to be appreciated and explored. "Next week," Evelyn said, surprising herself with her decisiveness. "Let's leave next week and stay as long as we want." That afternoon, she called Jacob and Madison, the first contact she'd had with her grandchildren since leaving Greensboro 3 weeks earlier. Lauren answered the phone with obvious reluctance. "Mama, what do you want?" "I want to speak with my grandchildren," Evelyn replied calmly, "to let them know I'm doing well and that I love them." There was a long pause, then Lauren's voice, slightly less hostile. "Hold on." When Jacob came to the phone, his excitement was immediate and genuine. "Nana, are you okay? Are you sad? Do you like living on the farm?" "I'm more than okay, sweetheart," Evelyn told him, realizing as she spoke that it was completely true. "I'm happy. Really, truly happy. And I wanted you to know that leaving had nothing to do with you and Madison. I left because I needed to remember who I am when I'm not trying to make everyone else comfortable." "I miss you," Jacob said quietly. "And I'm sorry Mom and Dad were mean to you." "I miss you too, sweet boy. But I want you to remember something important. You don't have to apologize for other people's choices. And you don't have to fix grown-up problems that aren't your responsibility to solve." When Madison got on the phone, she was crying before she spoke. "Nana, I'm sorry I didn't pay attention to you more. I'm sorry I was always on my phone during dinner." "Oh, sweetheart." Evelyn's heart ached for this child who was carrying guilt that didn't belong to her. "You don't need to apologize for being 12 years old. I love you exactly as you are, phone and all." "Will you come visit us?" Madison asked hopefully. "When your parents are ready to treat me with respect and kindness?" "Yes, I'll visit," Evelyn replied honestly. "But not before then, because I love you too much to show you that it's okay to accept treatment that makes you feel bad about yourself." After hanging up, Evelyn felt the complex mixture of sadness and strength that comes from setting boundaries with people you love. It hurt to maintain distance from her grandchildren, but she knew that showing them what self-respect looked like was ultimately a greater gift than teaching them that love meant accepting cruelty in silence. That evening, as she and Ruth Ann sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Evelyn felt something she'd almost forgotten existed: contentment. Not the frantic peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the deep satisfaction of a life lived in alignment with one's values. "Ruth Ann," she said quietly, "I want to thank you for saving my life. Honey, you saved your own life. I just provided the porch to sit on while you figured it out." Evelyn smiled, feeling the truth of those words settle in her chest. She had saved her own life, one difficult decision at a time. She'd chosen dignity over convenience, self-respect over family approval, authentic faith over religious obligation. And for the first time in years, she was excited to see what tomorrow would bring. "Thank you, Jesus," she whispered into the gathering dusk. "Thank you for loving me enough to help me find my way back to myself. Thank you for showing me that your love doesn't require me to disappear. Amen." 6 months later, Evelyn Grace Whitaker stood on the porch of Ruth Ann's farmhouse, watching the morning sun paint the spring garden in shades of gold and green. The daffodils had bloomed exactly as promised, creating a carpet of yellow joy that seemed to celebrate every new beginning. Her hands, no longer nervous and constantly moving to please others, rested peacefully on the porch railing as she breathed in the sweet air of a North Carolina spring. The woman who had left Lauren's house in November, broken, apologetic, believing herself to be a burden, had been transformed by 6 months of intentional healing and rediscovered faith. The Evelyn who stood here now moved with quiet confidence, spoke with gentle authority, and loved with boundaries that protected rather than depleted her spirit. The sound of gravel crunching under tires drew her attention to the driveway, where a familiar car was pulling up to the house. Lauren's silver sedan looked out of place among the rural simplicity of the farm, as sleek and anxious as its owner often appeared. Evelyn's heart began beating faster, but not with the old fear of confrontation. Instead, she felt the calm readiness of someone who had learned to love without losing herself in the process. Lauren stepped out of the car alone, her face bearing the weight of months of reflection and, perhaps, regret. She looked older somehow, more fragile, as if the armor of righteous indignation she'd worn for so long had finally become too heavy to carry. "Hello, Mama," Lauren said quietly, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "Hello, Lauren," Evelyn replied, her voice warm but measured. "You look tired. Have you been taking care of yourself?" The question, asked with genuine concern rather than criticism, seemed to catch Lauren off guard. Her eyes filled with tears she'd apparently been holding back for longer than she cared to admit. "Mama, Lauren's voice broke, and suddenly she was sobbing with the intensity of someone who'd been carrying impossible weight. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything I said, everything I did, everything I failed to do." Evelyn remained on the porch, her heart aching for her daughter's pain while also holding firm to the boundaries that had saved them both. "I can see that you're hurting, sweetheart. What's brought you here today?" Lauren wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, struggling to compose herself enough to speak clearly. "Everything fell apart, Mama. Everything. And the worst part is, I finally understand that it was all my fault." She took a shaky breath and continued. "After you left, things got worse between Travis and me. We started fighting about everything. Money, the kids, whose responsibility it was to do all the things you'd been doing without us even noticing. Madison started having panic attacks about school, and Jacob told his teacher that his family was mean to the people who loved them most." Evelyn's heart clenched for her grandchildren, but she remained silent, allowing Lauren to continue. "The teacher called for a conference, and when we sat down to talk about Jacob's behavior, he told her right in front of us that we'd made you leave because we called you a burden. He said he learned from you that families should love each other even when it's hard, and he couldn't understand why we couldn't love you when it was easy." Lauren's voice broke again. "A 10-year-old boy had to teach his parents about love, Mama. A 10-year-old. Ruth Ann appeared at the screen door, assessing the situation with the wisdom of someone who'd lived through enough family dramas to recognize both crisis and opportunity. "Would you like some sweet tea, Lauren? You look like you could use something cool to drink." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." Ruth Ann disappeared back into the house, giving mother and daughter space to navigate this difficult conversation while remaining close enough to provide support if needed. "There's more," Lauren continued, climbing the porch steps slowly as if each one required tremendous effort. "Travis lost his job 3 weeks ago, budget cuts at the hospital. And without your contributions to the household expenses, we can't make the mortgage payments. We're going to lose the house." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The woman they'd called a financial burden had actually been the stabilizing force holding their economic life together. "But that's not why I'm here," Lauren said quickly, as if afraid Evelyn might think this was merely a request for money. I'm here because I finally realized what I lost when I drove you away. I lost the mother who taught me how to love unconditionally. I lost the grandmother who was showing my children what it looked like to put family first. I lost the woman who was the best example of faith and forgiveness I've ever known. Evelyn sat down in one of the porch rockers, gesturing for Lauren to take the chair beside her. Tell me about the children. How are they really doing? They miss you every day, Lauren admitted. Madison keeps asking when you're coming home, and I have to keep explaining that you're not coming home because we made it impossible for you to stay. Jacob has been writing you letters that he never sends. Pages and pages of stories about school and soccer and things he wants to tell his Nana. The revelation about Jacob's letters nearly broke Evelyn's heart, but she held steady to the truth that had sustained her through these months of healing. I love those children more than my own life, Lauren. But I couldn't continue to show them that love means accepting treatment that diminishes your worth as a person. I know, Lauren whispered. I know that now. And I know that my children have been watching me treat my own mother with disrespect and cruelty, and learning that it's okay to hurt the people who love you most. Ruth Ann returned with glasses of sweet tea and a plate of homemade cookies, setting them on the small table between the rockers. I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything, she said quietly, retreating once again to give them privacy. Lauren took a sip of tea and seemed to gather courage from the simple, nurturing gesture. Mama, I need to tell you something else. Something I should have told you years ago. Evelyn waited, sensing that whatever came next would be crucial to any possibility of reconciliation. When Daddy died, I wasn't just scared about raising the kids without him. I was terrified that I'd inherited his weaknesses along with his strengths. I was afraid that I'd be weak like he was sometimes, that I'd lean on alcohol when things got hard, that I'd leave my family the way he threatened to leave us that one time when I was 16. This was new information, and Evelyn found herself reassessing years of family history through a different lens. When I asked you to come live with us, part of me genuinely wanted your help and support, Lauren continued. But part of me was also terrified that you'd see all my flaws as a mother and judge me the way I thought you must have judged Daddy for his struggles. I never judged your father, Evelyn said gently. I loved him through his struggles because that's what love does. And I never judged you, sweetheart. I watched you work so hard to be a good mother and wife, and I was proud of you. But I couldn't see that, Lauren sobbed. All I could see was the ways I was falling short of the mother you'd been to me. And instead of asking for help or admitting my fears, I decided you were the problem. I decided that your love was too much, too demanding, too challenging to my independence. Evelyn reached over and took her daughter's hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work and the trembling that spoke of deep emotional pain. I turned you into the enemy instead of recognizing you as the blessing you were, Lauren continued. I made you responsible for my own insecurities instead of dealing with them honestly. And in doing so, I destroyed the most loving relationship my children had in their lives. The admission hung between them like a bridge that might bear weight or might collapse under the pressure of too much truth spoken too late. Lauren, Evelyn said carefully, I forgive you. I forgave you months ago not because you deserved it, but because carrying anger was poisoning my own spirit. But forgiveness doesn't automatically restore a relationship. Trust has to be rebuilt. Respect has to be demonstrated, not just promised. I know, Lauren said quickly. I know I can't just apologize and expect everything to go back to the way it was. I know I have to prove that I've learned from my mistakes. But Mama, please give me a chance to try. Evelyn looked out over Ruth Ann's garden, where spring flowers bloomed in ordered beauty, each plant given the space and care it needed to flourish. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. What exactly are you asking for? I'm asking for a chance to show you that I can love you the way you deserve to be loved, Lauren said. I'm asking for permission to bring the children to visit you here so they can see their Nana in a place where she's appreciated and valued. I'm asking for forgiveness that leads to restoration, not just absolution. And what about Travis? What about the attitudes and behaviors that led to this situation in the first place? Lauren's face flushed with embarrassment. Travis and I are in counseling, both marriage counseling and individual therapy. He's had to confront some ugly truths about how he treated you, and he wants to apologize too. But I told him that his apology will have to wait until after mine, because this was my responsibility to fix. For the first time since Lauren's arrival, Evelyn smiled. That sounds like wisdom. They sat in silence for a few minutes, rocking gently while the spring breeze carried the scent of new growth and second chances. I'd like to see the children, Evelyn said finally. But not at your house, and not under the old arrangements. If they want to visit me here, where I'm respected and valued, they're welcome. If you want to rebuild our relationship, it has to happen on terms that honor both of us. Yes, Lauren said immediately. Yes, absolutely. Whatever you need. Whatever makes you feel safe and valued. And Lauren, I need you to understand something important. I'm not the same woman who left your house 6 months ago. I've rediscovered who I am when I'm not trying to please everyone else. I've remembered what it feels like to be loved without conditions. I won't go back to being invisible or apologetic for taking up space in the world. I don't want you to, Lauren said firmly. I want to know this woman you've become. I want to learn from her. I want my children to see their grandmother as the strong, confident, faithful woman she really is. Ruth Ann appeared in the doorway again, this time with a knowing smile. Evelyn, honey, why don't you show Lauren the garden? Spring's got everything blooming, and I think a walk would do you both good. As they strolled through the carefully tended rows of flowers and vegetables, Evelyn found herself sharing stories of her life at the farm, the weekly Bible studies, the friendships she'd formed at church, the trip to the Blue Ridge Mountains that had restored her sense of wonder and adventure. You sound happy, Lauren observed. Really, genuinely happy. I am, Evelyn replied. For the first time in years, I'm living my life instead of just surviving it. I'm making choices based on what brings me joy and serves God's purposes, not on what makes other people comfortable. I want that for you, Lauren said quietly. I want that for all of us. As they completed their circuit of the garden and returned to the porch, Evelyn felt something she hadn't experienced in years, hope for her family's future that didn't require her to sacrifice her own well-being. Bring the children next Sunday after church, she said. Ruth Ann makes the best fried chicken in 3 counties, and I'd love to show Jacob the chicken coop and teach Madison how to bake biscuits from scratch. Lauren's face lit up with the first genuine joy Evelyn had seen from her in years. They'll be so excited. Jacob's been talking about farm animals for months. And Lauren, I love you. I never stopped loving you, even when I had to leave. But love looks different now. It has boundaries that protect it and standards that honor it. Can you accept that? I can, Lauren said, tears flowing freely now, but tears of relief rather than despair. I want to learn how to love like that. I want to teach my children how to love like that. As Lauren's car disappeared down the gravel road, Evelyn remained on the porch, her heart full of gratitude for the mysterious ways God worked to heal broken relationships and restore damaged hearts. Ruth Ann joined her on the porch, settling into her own rocking chair with a satisfied sigh. How are you feeling about all that? Hopeful, Evelyn replied. Cautiously hopeful, but genuinely hopeful. That girl's got some growing up to do, but she's finally pointed in the right direction, Ruth Ann observed. And those grandbabies of yours are going to be so excited to see their Nana living her best life. That evening, as Evelyn knelt beside her bed for evening prayers, her words were filled with thanksgiving rather than supplication. She thanked God for the strength to leave a situation that was destroying her spirit. She thanked him for Ruth Ann's friendship and the healing power of unconditional acceptance. She thanked him for the courage to love with boundaries and the wisdom to know that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior. Most of all, she thanked him for the reminder that his love never requires us to disappear, that faith doesn't mean accepting mistreatment, and that sometimes the cross we're called to carry is the difficult work of loving ourselves enough to demand respect. Evelyn Grace Whitaker was 74 years old, and for the first time in years, she was excited about the future, not because her circumstances were perfect, but because she finally remembered who she was, a beloved daughter of the King, worthy of respect, deserving of kindness, and called to love herself with the same fierce devotion she'd always offered others. And that, she knew, was the beginning of every good thing that would follow. Have you ever felt like your love wasn't wanted by the people closest to you? Have you known someone who sacrificed everything for family, only to be treated as a burden? How did faith help you or them find the strength to choose dignity over desperation? Share your story in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel so this message can reach someone who needs to hear it today. May God bless everyone who's been through something like this. In Jesus' name, amen.